They came from the frozen north. They sailed in long wooden ships with carved dragon heads. The Vikings changed Europe forever. Have you ever wondered how a fierce Norse raider became the father of one of history's most powerful dynasties? What would drive a man to leave behind everything he knew and build something entirely new? The Northmen were known for their raids, their courage, and their hunger for land. They were explorers, warriors, and settlers, and among them, one man would carve his name into history. His descendants would one day conquer England. This is the story of Rollo of Normandy. Let us begin our journey in the lands of the north. Picture a world of deep fjords and towering mountains. Imagine forests so thick that sunlight barely touches the ground. This was Scandinavia. This was the homeland of the Vikings. The word Viking itself comes from the Old Norse language. It meant something like pirate raid or sea voyage. To go Viking was to set sail in search of wealth and adventure. It was not simply a name for a people. It was a way of life. The Viking Age began around the year 793. That was when Norse raiders attacked the monastery at Lindisfarne in northern England. The monks there had no warning. They had no defence. The Northmen came from the sea like a storm. They took treasure. They took captives. And then they vanished back across the waves. This attack shocked all of Christian Europe. It was the beginning of something new. For the next 300 years, the Vikings would reshape the world. But who were these people before they became raiders? To understand Rollo and his story, we must first understand the world that made him. Scandinavia, in the early medieval period, was a land of small kingdoms and chieftains. There was no single ruler of all the Norse lands. Instead, power was divided among many jarls and kings. Each controlled their own territory. Each commanded their own warriors. The geography of Scandinavia shaped its people in profound ways. Norway, where many historians believe Rollo was born, is a land of mountains and sea. The coastline stretches for thousands of miles. It is broken by countless fjords, those deep inlets carved by ancient glaciers. The mountains made overland travel difficult, but the sea was always there. The sea connected communities. The sea provided food, and the sea offered a highway to distant lands. The Norse people became master shipbuilders out of necessity. They developed the longship, one of the most remarkable vessels in human history. These ships were long and narrow. They sat low in the water. They could be rowed or sailed. Most importantly, they had a shallow draft. This meant they could travel up rivers that other ships could not reach. A Viking longship could cross the open ocean. It could also glide silently up a river to strike at towns far inland. This gave the Norse raiders an enormous advantage. Life in Scandinavia was hard. The growing season was short. Good farmland was limited. Winters were long and dark and cold. Families had to work together to survive. They raised cattle and sheep. They grew barley and oats when they could. They fished the cold northern waters, and they hunted in the great forests. Every member of a household had duties. Everyone contributed to survival. Society was organized around the family and the clan. Extended families lived together in longhouses. These were large wooden buildings, sometimes over 100 feet long. Inside, a central hearth provided warmth and light. Families slept on raised platforms along the walls. Animals were sometimes kept at one end of the building during winter. Life was communal. Privacy was rare. People lived close together, sharing warmth and food and stories. Above the common farmers were the jarls, the nobles of Norse society. These were wealthy landowners who commanded the loyalty of many followers. A jarl might control several farms and villages. He would have warriors sworn to his service. In times of war, he would lead his men into battle. In times of peace, he would settle disputes and maintain order. The jarls were powerful, but their power depended on the loyalty of their followers. A jarl who lost the respect of his men would soon lose everything. At the top of society were the kings. But Viking kings were not like the kings of later medieval Europe. Their power was limited. They ruled by consent as much as by force. A king who angered his people might find himself facing rebellion, or he might simply find that his warriors had gone to serve another lord. Kingship in the Viking world was often contested. Brothers fought brothers, sons fought fathers. The strong survived, the weak did not. Below the jarls and the free farmers were the thralls. These were slaves. Slavery was common in Viking society. Thralls might be captured in raids. They might be born into bondage, or they might have fallen into slavery through debt or crime. Thralls did the hardest work. They had few rights, but they were not without all hope. A thrall could sometimes earn freedom. The children of a free man and a thrall woman had a complicated status. Slavery was harsh, but it was not always permanent. Religion shaped every aspect of Norse life. The Vikings worshipped many gods. Odin was the All-Father, the god of wisdom and war and death. He had sacrificed his eye to gain knowledge. He hung on the world tree for 9 days to learn the secrets of the runes. Odin was a god of kings and poets and seekers of hidden truth. Warriors hoped to die bravely in battle so that Odin's servants, the Valkyries, would carry them to Valhalla. There they would feast and fight until the end of the world. Thor was the god of thunder. He was strong and straightforward. He protected humanity from the giants who threatened to destroy the world. Common people loved Thor. They wore hammer amulets in his honour. They called on him for protection. Thor was the god of farmers and fishermen, of ordinary folk who needed strength to face the challenges of daily life. Frey and Freya were gods of fertility and prosperity. Loki was the trickster, clever and dangerous. There were many other gods and goddesses, spirits and supernatural beings. The Norse believed that the world was full of hidden powers. They made offerings to the gods. They consulted seers and wise women. They read omens in the flight of birds and the patterns of runes. The concept of fate was central to Viking belief. The Norse believed that destiny was woven by the Norns, 3 mysterious beings who lived at the roots of the world tree. What was fated would come to pass. This did not make the Vikings passive. Instead, it gave them courage. If death was fated, then there was no point in fearing it. Better to face danger boldly and win glory that would live on after death. A man's reputation was his immortality. Great deeds would be remembered in songs and stories long after the hero had fallen. This was the world that shaped Rollo. This was the culture that made him. He grew up hearing tales of gods and heroes. He learned to sail and fight from childhood. He understood that a man must make his own fortune. He knew that the sea offered both danger and opportunity. And he lived in a time when the old ways were beginning to change. The late 8th and 9th centuries saw enormous upheaval in Scandinavia. Populations were growing. Land was becoming scarce. Young men with no inheritance had to find their fortunes elsewhere. At the same time, the kingdoms of Scandinavia were beginning to consolidate. Powerful kings were bringing more territory under their control. This meant less room for independent chieftains. It meant that ambitious men might find themselves squeezed out. The raids on foreign lands offered a solution to these pressures. A young warrior could join a raiding party and return with silver and gold. He could win glory and reputation. He could attract followers of his own. The most successful raiders became wealthy and powerful. They could establish themselves as lords in their own right. The Viking expansion was driven by many factors. Population pressure and political conflict at home were among the most important. Trade was also vital to the Viking world. The Norse were not only raiders, they were also merchants. They established trading networks that stretched from Scandinavia to the Byzantine Empire. They traded furs and amber and slaves. They brought back silver and silk and spices. Viking traders travelled down the rivers of Russia to reach Constantinople. They crossed the Atlantic to reach Iceland and Greenland and eventually North America. The same ships that carried raiders to plunder monasteries also carried merchants to distant markets. The distinction between trading and raiding was often blurry. A Viking expedition might trade peacefully in one place and attack another. The decision often depended on the strength of the opposition. If a town was well defended, trade was preferable. If it was weak, why not take what you wanted? This flexibility was characteristic of Viking enterprise. They were pragmatic people. They did what worked. By the middle of the 9th century, Viking activity had intensified dramatically. What had begun as occasional raids became sustained campaigns. Large fleets gathered to attack major targets. Vikings began to overwinter in foreign lands rather than returning home each fall. They established permanent bases. They demanded tribute from terrified populations, and they began to settle, to take land and make it their own. This was the context for Rollo's life. He was born into a world in motion. The old boundaries were breaking down. New opportunities were opening up. A bold man with a strong sword arm could rise high. He could win wealth and land and power. He could found a dynasty that would endure for centuries. But first he had to survive. First he had to prove himself. The path from Scandinavian warrior to Norman duke was long and dangerous. Many started that journey. Few completed it. Rollo was one of the few. The origins of Rollo are shrouded in mystery and legend. Different sources tell different stories. Some say he came from Norway. Others claim he was Danish. The truth is difficult to determine after more than 1,000 years. But we can piece together a picture of who he was and where he came from. We can understand the world of his youth and the forces that shaped him. The most detailed account of Rollo's origins comes from a Norman historian named Dudo of St. Quentin. Dudo wrote about 100 years after Rollo's death. He had access to oral traditions and perhaps some written records, but he was also writing to please his Norman patrons. He wanted to make Rollo and his descendants look good, so we must read his account with some caution. Still, Dudo provides our best window into Rollo's early life. According to Dudo, Rollo was born in Norway. His father was a powerful nobleman, a jarl or perhaps even a king. Dudo calls him a certain wealthy and powerful man among the Danes. But the context suggests Norway. Rollo's original Norse name was probably Hrolf. In Old Norse, this name meant famous wolf. It was a fitting name for a man who had become one of the most feared warriors of his age. Dudo tells us that Rollo had a brother named Gurim. The two brothers grew up together in their father's household. They learned the skills that every Norse nobleman needed. They learned to fight with sword and axe and spear. They learned to sail the longships. They learned to lead men. They heard the old stories of gods and heroes. They dreamed of winning glory of their own. The young Hrolf was said to be enormous. He was so large that no horse could carry him. This is probably an exaggeration, but it suggests that Rollo was an unusually big and strong man. In an age when battles were decided by hand-to-hand combat, size mattered. A tall warrior with a long reach had a significant advantage. Rollo's physical presence would have commanded respect and fear. According to the legends, trouble came to Rollo's family when he was still a young man. A new king rose to power in Norway. This king was determined to bring all the petty kingdoms and chieftains under his control. He demanded submission. He demanded tribute. Those who resisted faced his wrath. Rollo's father, whoever he was, apparently resisted. The details vary in different accounts. In some versions, Rollo's father was killed by the king. In others, he was driven into exile. What seems clear is that Rollo found himself on the wrong side of royal power. He was outlawed. His lands were confiscated. He had to flee for his life. This was a common enough story in Viking Age Scandinavia. Political fortunes rose and fell quickly. A man who was powerful one year might be dead or exiled the next. Some historians have tried to identify the Norwegian king who drove Rollo into exile. The most common candidate is Harald Fairhair. Harald was the first king to unite most of Norway under a single rule. He fought many battles against rival chieftains. He drove many of his enemies into exile. The timing roughly matches Rollo's career. It is possible that Rollo was one of the many Norwegian nobles who fled Harold's consolidation of power, but we cannot be certain. Other sources suggest that Rollo may have been Danish rather than Norwegian. Icelandic sagas mention a figure called Gongu Hrolf, which means walking Hrolf or Hrolf the Walker. This nickname supposedly came from his great size, which made it impossible for him to ride a horse. He had to walk everywhere. This Gongu Hrolf is sometimes identified with Rollo. The sagas place his origins in different locations, adding to the confusion. What we can say with more confidence is that Rollo emerged as a leader of Viking raiders in the late 9th century. Whether he was Norwegian or Danish, whether he was driven out by Harold Fairhair or some other king, he found his way to the Viking fleets that were terrorizing Western Europe. He was young and ambitious and dispossessed. He had nothing to lose and everything to gain. The raiding life offered him a chance to rebuild his fortunes. The transition from exile to raider was common in the Viking world. A man who lost his lands at home could seek wealth abroad. If he was brave and lucky, he might return home in triumph. Or he might find new lands to settle, new kingdoms to carve out. The Viking expansion was fueled by men like Rollo, men who had been pushed out of their homelands and were hungry for a second chance. Rollo would have joined a war band, a group of warriors bound together by loyalty to a leader. These warbands were the basic unit of Viking military organisation. A successful leader attracted followers with promises of plunder and glory. He kept their loyalty by sharing the spoils fairly and leading them to victory. A leader who failed would soon find himself abandoned. His men would drift away to serve someone more successful. The early years of Rollo's raiding career are obscure. We do not know exactly when he left Scandinavia or where he first struck, but by the 880s he had become a significant figure. He was leading his own war band. He was making a name for himself. He was becoming one of the most feared Viking chieftains operating in the lands of the Franks. Before we follow Rollo to Francia, we should understand what he was leaving behind. Scandinavia in the late 9th century was changing rapidly. The old order of independent chieftains was giving way to larger kingdoms. Harold Fairhair in Norway, the kings of Denmark, and various Swedish rulers were all working to consolidate power. This process created winners and losers. The winners gained power and security. The losers faced submission or exile. At the same time, Christianity was beginning to make inroads into the Norse world. Missionaries had been active in Scandinavia for decades. Some Norse people had converted, especially those who traded with Christian lands. But the old gods still held sway for most. The conversion of Scandinavia would take centuries to complete. Rollo was born into the old faith. He worshipped Odin and Thor. He believed in fate and the importance of a warrior's reputation. These beliefs would shape his actions throughout his life. The Rollo who left Scandinavia was a product of this world. He was a warrior trained from childhood in the arts of combat. He was a sailor who knew the sea and its moods. He was a pagan who honoured the old gods. He was an exile who had lost his birthright. And he was ambitious, determined to make a new place for himself in the world. All of these elements would come together in the decades ahead. We should also consider what Rollo might have known about the lands to the south. The Vikings had been raiding Western Europe for almost a century by the time Rollo came of age. Stories of these raids would have circulated throughout Scandinavia. Young warriors would have heard tales of rich monasteries and weak kings, of silver and gold waiting to be taken. They would have heard of the great rivers that led deep into the heart of Francia, of the cities that lined their banks. The south was a land of opportunity for those bold enough to seize it. Rollo would have known about the earlier Viking successes. He would have heard of the great heathen army that had conquered much of England. He would have known about the Viking kingdoms established in Ireland. He would have heard of the raids on Paris and the tribute paid by frightened Frankish kings. These stories would have fired his imagination. They would have shown him what was possible. If other Vikings could win kingdoms, why not him? The decision to go Viking was not taken lightly. The sea was dangerous. Battles were deadly. Many who set out never returned. But for a man like Rollo, there was no real choice. He had lost everything at home. He had to seek his fortune elsewhere. The raiding life was his best option. It was his only option. So he gathered his followers, boarded his ships, and set sail for the lands of the Franks. His destiny awaited him across the sea. To understand Rollo's story, we must understand the land he came to conquer. Francia was the heartland of the old Carolingian Empire. It had been ruled by Charlemagne, the greatest king of the early medieval West. Charlemagne had united much of Western Europe under his rule. He had been crowned emperor by the Pope in the year 800. His empire stretched from the Pyrenees to the Elbe, from the North Sea to central Italy. It was the largest political unit in Western Europe since the fall of Rome. But Charlemagne's empire did not long survive him. His son Louis the Pious struggled to maintain unity, and after Louis died in 840, the empire was divided among his three sons. This division, formalised in the Treaty of Verdun in 843, created three separate kingdoms. The Western Kingdom would eventually become France. The Eastern Kingdom would become Germany. The Middle Kingdom, a long strip running from the North Sea to Italy, would be fought over for centuries. The division of the empire was a disaster for defence. The Carolingian military system depended on unity and central coordination. When the empire split, that coordination broke down. Each kingdom had to defend itself, and each kingdom was weakened by internal conflicts. The sons and grandsons of Charlemagne fought endless civil wars. They were too busy fighting each other to deal effectively with external threats. The Vikings took full advantage of this weakness. They had been raiding the Frankish coasts since the late 8th century, but the raids intensified dramatically after the empire's division. The Vikings discovered that the Franks were divided and distracted. They discovered that the great rivers of Francia were highways into the heart of the kingdom. They discovered that there was wealth beyond imagining waiting to be taken. The Seine River was particularly important. It flows from the interior of France to the English Channel. Along its banks lay some of the richest lands in the kingdom. And at the mouth of the Seine was the region that would one day be called Normandy. The Vikings learned this river well. They used it again and again to strike deep into Frankish territory. The first major Viking attack on Paris came in 845. A fleet of about 120 ships sailed up the Seine. They were led by a chieftain named Ragnar, who may or may not be the same as the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok. The Vikings met little resistance. They captured and sacked Paris on Easter Sunday. The Frankish king, Charles the Bald, was unable to stop them. Instead, he paid them to leave. He gave them 7,000 pounds of silver. This was the first of many such payments. The payment of tribute, called Danegeld, became a common Frankish response to Viking attacks. It was easier and cheaper than fighting. A king could pay the Vikings to go away and attack someone else. But this policy had serious drawbacks. It encouraged more attacks. Why would the Vikings stop raiding when raiding was so profitable? Each payment of Danegeld attracted more raiders. The problem grew worse, not better. Throughout the 850s and 860s, Viking raids on Francia intensified. The raiders grew bolder. They stayed longer. They began to establish permanent bases where they could overwinter. These bases allowed them to raid year-round, rather than returning to Scandinavia each fall. The Vikings were no longer just raiders. They were becoming occupiers. The Frankish response was inconsistent and often ineffective. Some kings tried to fight. They raised armies and built fortifications. They achieved occasional victories, but they could not be everywhere at once. The Vikings had the initiative. They could choose when and where to strike. The Franks were always reacting, always one step behind. Other kings tried diplomacy. They made deals with Viking leaders. They offered land and titles in exchange for peace. They hoped to turn the Vikings into allies, or at least to play different Viking groups against each other. This strategy sometimes worked in the short term, but it also legitimized the Viking presence. It gave the raiders a foothold that they could expand. The church suffered terribly during these years. Monasteries were favourite Viking targets. They were rich and poorly defended. The monks had gold and silver, precious books and sacred vessels. They had no weapons and no training in warfare. A monastery was easy pickings for a Viking warband. Many of the great religious houses of Francia were sacked repeatedly. Some were abandoned entirely. The monks fled to safer locations, carrying what treasures they could save. The common people suffered most of all. When the Vikings came, peasants had few options. They could flee, abandoning their homes and fields. They could hide and hope the raiders passed them by. Or they could be killed or captured. Many thousands were taken as slaves. They were shipped back to Scandinavia or sold in the slave markets of the Viking world. The human cost of the Viking raids is impossible to calculate, but it was enormous. By the 880s, the situation had reached a crisis point. Viking armies were operating throughout Francia. They controlled large stretches of territory. They had established fortified camps from which they dominated the surrounding countryside. The Frankish kings seemed powerless to stop them. The kingdom was on the verge of collapse. It was in this context that Rollo emerged as a major figure. He was one of many Viking leaders operating in Francia during these years. But he would prove to be more successful than most. He would find a way to turn temporary raiding into permanent settlement. He would transform himself from a Viking chieftain into a Frankish duke. But that transformation lay in the future. First, Rollo had to establish himself as a power to be reckoned with. The Viking strategy in Francia evolved over time. In the early years, raids were hit-and-run affairs. A fleet would appear, attack a target, grab what plunder it could, and withdraw. But as the Vikings learned the land and its defences, their operations became more sophisticated. They began to coordinate multiple attacks. They established bases where they could store supplies and shelter their ships. They learned to exploit the political divisions among the Franks. The rivers were key to Viking success. The Seine, the Loire, the Rhone, and other rivers allowed Viking ships to penetrate deep into the interior. Towns that had never worried about seaborne attacks suddenly found themselves vulnerable. The Vikings could appear with little warning, strike hard, and escape before any defence could be organised. The speed and mobility of their ships gave them an enormous advantage. The Frankish military system was not designed to deal with this kind of threat. Carolingian armies were built around heavy cavalry. Armoured horsemen were the elite troops, the decisive force in battle. But cavalry was useless against enemies who arrived by water and refused to fight on Frankish terms. The Vikings avoided pitched battles when they could. They preferred to raid and withdraw, to wear down their enemies without risking a decisive confrontation. Fortifications offered some protection. Towns with strong walls could resist Viking attacks. But building and maintaining walls was expensive. Many towns had let their defences decay during the long peace of Charlemagne's reign. Now they paid the price. Towns without walls were helpless. Even towns with walls could be starved into submission if the Vikings were patient enough to maintain a siege. The Vikings also learned to exploit the political situation. They made deals with Frankish nobles who were rebelling against their kings. They played different factions against each other. They accepted bribes to attack one lord's enemies. The political fragmentation of Francia made it easy for the Vikings to find allies and opportunities. A united kingdom might have driven them out. A divided kingdom could only watch as they grew stronger. Religion played a complex role in the conflict. The Vikings were pagans, worshippers of Odin and Thor. The Franks were Christians, The Church portrayed the Viking attacks as divine punishment for the sins of the Frankish people. This interpretation may seem strange to modern readers, but it made sense in the medieval worldview. God controlled everything. If he allowed the pagans to triumph, it must be because the Christians had angered him. The solution was repentance and prayer, not just military action. Some churchmen saw the Vikings as potential converts. If the pagans could be brought to Christianity, they would stop attacking churches and monasteries. They would become part of Christian civilization. This hope would eventually be realized, but it took time. The conversion of the Vikings was a gradual process, accomplished through contact and intermarriage as much as through missionary preaching. The 880s saw some of the most intense Viking activity in Frankish history. Large armies roamed the countryside. Major cities were attacked. The kingdom seemed to be falling apart. It was during this decade that Rollo rose to prominence. He was one of the most successful Viking leaders of his generation. He commanded a large and loyal following. He won battles and accumulated wealth. He was becoming a figure that the Frankish kings could not ignore. The stage was set for the dramatic events that would follow. The siege of Paris, the negotiations with the Frankish king, the treaty that would create Normandy. All of these lay just ahead. Rollo had proven himself as a raider and a warrior. Now he would have the chance to prove himself as something more. He would have the chance to become a builder, a ruler, a founder of dynasties. The next chapter of his story would change the history of Europe. Rollo's emergence as a major Viking leader came during the 880s. This was a time of maximum Viking pressure on the Frankish kingdoms. Multiple armies were operating simultaneously. Coordination between different Viking groups was increasing. The Franks were struggling to respond. It was the perfect environment for an ambitious warrior to make his mark. The historical sources give us only glimpses of Rollo's early career in Francia. We know he was active in the region around the Seine. We know he commanded a substantial force. We know he was successful enough to attract followers and accumulate wealth. But the details of his early raids are mostly lost to history. We can reconstruct the general pattern of his activities, even if we cannot trace every campaign. Rollo would have operated in the classic Viking manner. His force would have consisted of several hundred warriors, perhaps more. They would have travelled in a fleet of longships, probably between 10 and 30 vessels. Each ship could carry between 30 and 60 men, depending on its size. This gave a Viking fleet both mobility and striking power. They could appear anywhere along the coast or up the rivers. They could concentrate quickly for major attacks, or disperse to raid multiple targets simultaneously. The warriors who followed Rollo were bound to him by personal loyalty. Some may have been kinsmen or men from his home district in Scandinavia. Others would have joined him because of his success. A Viking leader attracted followers by winning. Each victory brought more men to his banner. Each share of plunder distributed fairly built loyalty and trust. A successful chieftain became a magnet for ambitious warriors. The economics of Viking raiding were straightforward. The goal was to acquire wealth. This could come in many forms. Precious metals were the most desirable. Gold and silver could be easily transported and readily converted into other goods. Jewels and fine metalwork were also prized. Captives could be sold as slaves or ransomed back to their families. Even livestock and grain had value, though they were harder to transport. Monasteries and churches were prime targets because they concentrated wealth. A major monastery might have accumulated centuries' worth of donations. It would have gold and silver vessels for religious services. It would have jewelled book covers and reliquaries. It would have stores of food and wine. And it would have little in the way of defences. The monks relied on the sanctity of their calling for protection. Against the pagan Vikings, that protection was worthless. Towns were also attractive targets. A prosperous trading town would have merchants with goods and money. It would have craftsmen with valuable tools and products. It would have stores of food and other supplies. If the town lacked walls, it was vulnerable. If it had walls but a small garrison, it might still be taken by a determined assault. Even well-defended towns might pay tribute to avoid attack. The countryside offered less concentrated wealth, but more safety for the raiders. Peasant farms had food and livestock. They had tools and household goods. They had people who could be enslaved, and they had almost no defences. A Viking band could sweep through a rural district, taking what it wanted with little risk. The cumulative effect of such raids was devastating for the local population. Rollo proved adept at all aspects of Viking warfare. He knew when to attack and when to withdraw. He knew how to keep his men fed and motivated. He knew how to negotiate with enemies and allies. He knew how to turn military success into political power. These skills set him apart from many of his contemporaries. Many Viking leaders won victories, but could not hold their gains. Rollo was different. He thought in terms of the long game. The Frankish sources that mention Rollo are often hostile. They were written by monks and clerics who had suffered from Viking attacks. They portray the Vikings as savage pagans, enemies of God and civilization. This perspective is understandable but one-sided. The Vikings were certainly violent, but so were the Franks. The difference was that the Vikings were outsiders, pagans attacking a Christian society. This made them seem more threatening, more alien, more evil. Reading between the lines of these hostile sources, we can see that Rollo was a formidable figure. He inspired fear in his enemies and loyalty in his followers. He was physically imposing and personally brave. He was also intelligent and adaptable. He could learn from his experiences and adjust his strategies. These qualities would serve him well in the years ahead. By the mid-880s, Rollo had established himself as one of the leading Viking chieftains in the Seine region. He controlled a significant territory. He had a reputation that drew warriors to his service. He was wealthy enough to reward his followers generously. He was powerful enough that the Frankish authorities had to take him seriously. He was no longer just another raider. He was a political force. The other Viking leaders in Francia were both rivals and potential allies. Relations between different Viking groups were complex. Sometimes they cooperated for major operations. Sometimes they competed for the same targets. Sometimes they fought each other. A successful chieftain had to navigate these relationships carefully. He had to know when to ally and when to fight, when to share and when to take. Rollo seems to have been skilled at Viking politics. He built alliances when they served his interests. He avoided unnecessary conflicts with other Viking leaders. He focused on the real enemy, the Frankish kingdom and its defenders. This focus allowed him to accumulate power steadily. While other Viking leaders rose and fell, Rollo endured. The Frankish political situation in the 880s was chaotic. The Carolingian dynasty was fragmenting. Different branches of the family competed for power. Nobles took advantage of royal weakness to increase their own independence. The kingdom was divided and distracted. This created opportunities for the Vikings that a strong united kingdom would never have offered. The Emperor Charles the Fat briefly reunited most of the Carolingian lands in the 880s. But Charles was a weak ruler, unable to provide effective leadership. His response to the Viking threat was inconsistent. Sometimes he fought. Sometimes he paid tribute. Sometimes he tried to play different Viking groups against each other. Nothing worked consistently. The Vikings continued to grow stronger. It was during Charles the Fat's reign that the most famous Viking attack on Paris occurred. In 885, a massive Viking army appeared before the city. This was not Rollo's force alone, but a coalition of several Viking groups. The siege that followed would become legendary. It would demonstrate both the strength of Viking arms and the resilience of Frankish resistance, and it would set the stage for the eventual settlement that would create Normandy. Rollo's exact role in the siege of Paris is debated by historians. Some sources suggest he was one of the leaders of the attacking force. Others are less clear. What seems certain is that Rollo was active in the Seine region during this period. Whether he was at Paris itself or operating elsewhere, he was part of the broader Viking campaign that brought the Frankish kingdom to its knees. The years leading up to the siege saw Rollo consolidating his position. He was building the force and the reputation that would make him a major player in the events to come. He was learning the land and its people. He was developing the skills of leadership that would serve him as a ruler. The raider was slowly becoming something more. He was becoming a statesman, though he might not have recognized that transformation in himself. Rollo's base of operations during these years was likely in the lower Seine valley. This region offered many advantages for a Viking leader. The river provided easy access to the interior of Francia. The coastline offered escape routes if things went badly. The land itself was fertile and productive, capable of supporting a large force, and the local Frankish authorities were too weak to drive the Vikings out. The Vikings who settled in this region began to change. They were no longer just raiders passing through. They were becoming residents, even if unwelcome ones. They built more permanent camps. They established relationships with the local population. Some took Frankish wives or concubines. Their children grew up speaking both Norse and the local Romance language. The process of assimilation had already begun, even before any formal settlement. Rollo watched and learned during these years. He observed how the Franks governed their lands. He saw how they collected taxes and administered justice. He noted the role of the church in Frankish society. He understood that ruling a territory required more than military force. It required systems and institutions. It required the cooperation, or at least the acquiescence, of the local population. These lessons would prove invaluable when his time came. The relationship between Vikings and Franks was not purely hostile. Trade continued even during periods of intense raiding. Viking merchants brought goods from Scandinavia and beyond. Frankish merchants sought access to northern markets. Economic connections persisted alongside military conflict. Some Franks even collaborated with the Vikings, seeing opportunity in the chaos. The situation was more complex than a simple clash of civilizations. Rollo also had to manage his own followers. A Viking warband was not a disciplined army in the modern sense. It was a collection of free warriors who had chosen to follow a particular leader. They could leave if they were dissatisfied. They expected to be consulted on major decisions. They demanded their fair share of any plunder. A leader who ignored these expectations would soon find himself without followers. Managing a warband required a combination of generosity and strength. A leader had to share wealth freely. He had to reward loyalty and punish betrayal. He had to lead from the front in battle, demonstrating personal courage. He had to settle disputes among his followers fairly. He had to project confidence, even when the situation was uncertain. Rollo excelled at all of these tasks. His men trusted him and followed him willingly. The size of Rollo's force fluctuated over time. After a successful raid, warriors would flock to join him. After a setback, some might drift away to other leaders. The core of his warband was probably a few hundred men who had been with him for years. Around this core, a larger number of warriors came and went depending on circumstances. At his peak, Rollo may have commanded several thousand men, though precise numbers are impossible to determine. The weapons and equipment of Rollo's warriors were typical of the Viking age. The sword was the prestige weapon, expensive and highly valued. A good sword was named and treasured, passed down from father to son. But most warriors fought with spears and axes, which were cheaper and easier to obtain. Shields were essential, large round wooden shields that could deflect blows and form a wall in battle. Armour was less common. Wealthy warriors might have mail shirts, laboriously crafted from thousands of interlocking iron rings. Most made do with thick leather garments that offered some protection. Helmets were worn by those who could afford them, simple iron caps that protected the skull. The image of horned Viking helmets is a modern myth. Real Viking helmets were practical, not decorative. The longships that carried Rollo's men were marvels of naval engineering. They were built from overlapping planks of oak, a technique called clinker construction. This made them flexible and resilient, able to ride the waves rather than fighting them. A single mast carried a large square sail for ocean crossings. Oars allowed for precise manoeuvring in rivers and coastal waters. The shallow draft meant the ships could beach almost anywhere. Life aboard a longship was hard. The vessels were open to the weather. There was little shelter from rain or spray. The men slept on deck, wrapped in cloaks and furs. Food was simple: dried fish and meat, hard bread, whatever could be stored without spoiling. Fresh water was always a concern on long voyages. Yet the Vikings endured these hardships willingly. The promise of wealth and glory made the suffering worthwhile. Rollo's fleet probably numbered between 20 and 50 ships during his peak years. This was a substantial force by Viking standards. It gave him the ability to threaten major targets and to defend against rivals. The ships were his most valuable assets, the key to his mobility and power. He would have guarded them carefully and maintained them well. As the 880s progressed, the pressure on the Frankish kingdom intensified. Viking armies were everywhere. The royal government seemed paralysed. Local lords were left to defend themselves as best they could. Some succeeded, building castles and organising resistance. Others failed, their lands ravaged and their people scattered. The kingdom was fragmenting under the strain. Rollo positioned himself to take advantage of this chaos. He was patient and strategic, willing to wait for the right opportunity. He continued to raid and plunder, building his wealth and reputation. But he also began to think about something more permanent. The life of a raider was profitable but precarious. A single defeat could undo years of success. Rollo wanted something more secure. He wanted land of his own. The idea of Vikings settling in Frankish territory was not new. It had been tried before, with mixed results. Some Viking leaders had accepted grants of land in exchange for defending against other Vikings. These arrangements sometimes worked and sometimes collapsed. The challenge was finding a way to make settlement permanent, to transform raiders into rulers. Rollo would eventually find that way, but first came the great siege that would shake the Frankish kingdom to its foundations. The siege of Paris in 885 and 886 was one of the defining events of the Viking Age. It brought together the largest Viking army ever seen in Francia. It tested the defences of the most important city in the western Frankish kingdom, and it exposed the weakness of the Carolingian monarchy for all to see. The siege would have profound consequences for the future of France and for the career of Rollo. Paris in the 9th century was not the vast metropolis it would later become. The city was concentrated on an island in the Seine River, the Ile de la Cité. This island had been the heart of Paris since Roman times. It was connected to the banks by two bridges, one to the north and one to the south. The bridges were defended by fortified towers. The island itself was protected by walls. It was a strong position, but it had never faced a threat like the one that appeared in November of 885. The Viking army that arrived before Paris was enormous. Contemporary sources give various estimates, ranging from hundreds to tens of thousands of ships. The actual number was probably somewhere in between, perhaps 300 to 400 vessels, carrying somewhere between 10,000 and 30,000 warriors. Even the lower estimates represent an unprecedented concentration of Viking power. This army was not a unified force under a single commander. It was a coalition of many different Viking groups, each with its own leader. The sources name several of these leaders, including a chieftain called Sigfrid, who seems to have been the overall commander. Rollo may have been among the leaders, though his exact role is uncertain. What is clear is that this was a major operation, carefully planned and well organised. The Vikings' goal was not necessarily to capture Paris itself. What they really wanted was to pass the city and continue up the Seine to raid the rich lands beyond. The bridges at Paris blocked their path. The fortified towers on the bridges prevented them from simply sailing through. They had to either take the city or convince its defenders to let them pass. The defence of Paris was led by two remarkable men. Count Odo was the military commander, a warrior of great courage and skill. Bishop Jocelyn was the spiritual leader, rallying the people with his faith and determination. Together, they organised a defence that would become legendary. They refused to let the Vikings pass. They refused to pay tribute. They would fight. The siege began in late November of 885. The Vikings launched immediate assaults on the fortified towers guarding the bridges. They used every technique of siege warfare they knew. They built siege engines to batter the walls. They tried to set fires to burn the wooden structures. They launched wave after wave of infantry attacks. The defenders fought back with equal determination. They poured boiling oil on the attackers. They threw stones and shot arrows. They made sorties to destroy Viking siege equipment. The fighting was intense and brutal. Both sides suffered heavy casualties. The Vikings captured one of the towers after the bridge connecting it to the island collapsed. But they could not take the main defences. The city held. As winter set in, the siege settled into a grim standoff. The Vikings could not take Paris. The Parisians could not drive them away. The winter of 885 to 886 was hard for both sides. The Vikings spread out to forage, raiding the surrounding countryside for food and supplies. The Parisians endured hunger and disease within their walls. Reinforcements trickled in to help the defenders, but not enough to break the siege. Count Odo slipped out of the city to seek help from the emperor. He returned with promises of relief, but the imperial army was slow to gather. The siege continued through the spring and into the summer of 886. The Vikings launched new assaults. The defenders repelled them. Disease swept through both camps. Men died of sickness as well as wounds. The situation seemed hopeless for the Parisians, yet they would not surrender. Their resistance became a symbol of Frankish determination in the face of overwhelming odds. Finally, in the autumn of 886, Emperor Charles the Fat arrived with a large army. The Parisians expected him to attack the Vikings and lift the siege. Instead, Charles negotiated. He agreed to pay the Vikings a large tribute, 700 pounds of silver. Even more shockingly, he gave them permission to sail up the Seine and raid Burgundy, which had been in rebellion against him. Charles used the Vikings as a weapon against his own subjects. The people of Paris were outraged. They had suffered and died for nearly a year, only to see their emperor pay off the enemy and unleash them on other Franks. The prestige of the Carolingian dynasty never recovered from this humiliation. Charles the Fat was deposed in 887 and died shortly afterward. The empire he had briefly reunited fell apart permanently. The age of Carolingian greatness was over. The aftermath of the siege transformed the political landscape of Francia. Count Odo, the hero of the defence, was elected king of the Western Franks in 888. This was a revolutionary development. Odo was not a Carolingian. He was the first non-Carolingian to rule the Western Kingdom. His elevation showed that military ability now mattered more than royal blood. A new era was beginning. For the Vikings, the siege of Paris was a qualified success. They had not captured the city, but they had extracted a large tribute. They had demonstrated their power and exposed Frankish weakness. They had gained access to new raiding grounds in Burgundy, and they had learned that even the strongest Frankish defences could be overcome with enough persistence. Rollo emerged from this period as one of the most powerful Viking leaders in Francia. Whether he participated directly in the siege of Paris or operated elsewhere during those months, He benefited from the chaos that followed. The Frankish kingdom was weaker than ever. The opportunities for an ambitious Viking chieftain were greater than ever. Rollo was ready to seize them. The years after the siege saw continued Viking activity throughout Francia. The payment of tribute had not brought peace, only a temporary respite. New raids followed as surely as spring followed winter. The Vikings had learned that the Franks would pay to avoid fighting. This made raiding even more profitable. Why risk battle when you could simply threaten and collect tribute? Rollo's operations during these years focused on the lower Seine Valley. This region was becoming his base, his home territory. He knew its rivers and roads, its towns and villages. He knew which targets were worth attacking and which were too well defended. He knew the local lords and their capabilities. This knowledge gave him an advantage over other Viking leaders, who were less familiar with the terrain. The local Frankish population had to accommodate the Viking presence. Some fled to safer regions, others stayed and tried to survive. They paid tribute when demanded. They provided supplies when required. They avoided provoking the Vikings unnecessarily. A pragmatic coexistence developed, not friendship but a grudging mutual tolerance. Some Franks found opportunities in the new situation. Merchants who could trade with the Vikings prospered. Interpreters who could bridge the language gap were valuable. Local strongmen who could negotiate with the Vikings on behalf of their communities gained power and influence. The Viking presence disrupted traditional hierarchies and created new paths to advancement. The church struggled to maintain its presence in the affected regions. Many monasteries had been abandoned or destroyed. Bishops had fled their sees. The institutional structure of Christianity was badly damaged. Yet the faith itself survived. Priests continued to minister to their flocks. Believers continued to pray and hope. The church would eventually recover and even benefit from the Viking settlement, but that lay in the future. Rollo's attitude toward Christianity during these years is unclear. He was raised as a pagan, worshipping the Norse gods, but he had extensive contact with Christians through raiding and trading. He would have seen churches and monasteries, met priests and monks. He may have developed some understanding of Christian beliefs, even if he did not share them. This exposure would prove important when the time came to negotiate with Frankish authorities. The political situation in the Western Frankish kingdom remained unstable throughout the 890s and into the early 900s. King Odo died in 898. He was succeeded by Charles the Simple, a Carolingian who had been passed over in 888. Charles was not a strong ruler, but he was determined to restore order to his kingdom. He understood that the Viking problem had to be solved. The endless cycle of raids and tribute payments was destroying his realm. Charles began to consider a radical solution. What if the Vikings could be transformed from enemies into allies? What if they could be given land and responsibility, tied to the kingdom by grants and obligations? This approach had been tried before with limited success. But perhaps with the right leader, the right terms, the right circumstances, it could work. Charles began to look for a Viking chieftain who might be willing to make a deal. Rollo was the obvious candidate. He was the most powerful Viking leader in the Seine region. He had demonstrated staying power, maintaining his position for years while other chieftains rose and fell. He seemed interested in something more than mere raiding. He had begun to act like a territorial lord, defending his area against other Vikings and establishing stable relationships with the local population. He was someone Charles could negotiate with. The negotiations that followed would change history. They would create a new political entity, the Duchy of Normandy. They would transform Rollo from a Viking raider into a Frankish noble. They would set in motion a chain of events that would culminate a century and a half later in the Norman conquest of England. But all of that lay in the future. First, the two sides had to find terms they could both accept. The territory that Rollo received in 911 was not yet Normandy. It was simply a grant of land. a foothold on the Frankish coast. The transformation of this grant into a true duchy, with its own identity and institutions, would take decades. Rollo began that work. His son and grandson would continue it. By the mid-10th century, Normandy had become one of the most powerful principalities in France. The name Normandy itself tells the story. It comes from Normanny, the Latin word for Northman, the land of the Northmen, the territory settled by Vikings. This name distinguished the region from the rest of Francia. It acknowledged the Norse origins of its rulers. It marked Normandy as something different, something new. The name stuck because it captured a real truth about the place and its people. Rollo's first task was to establish control over his new territory. This was not automatic. The grant from King Charles gave Rollo legal authority, but actual power had to be built through effort and skill. Rollo had to impose his will on a diverse population. He had to create systems of administration and justice. He had to defend his borders against external threats. He had to manage the competing interests of his followers. The city of Rouen became Rollo's capital. This was a natural choice. Rouen was the largest and most important city in the region. It sat at a strategic point on the Seine, where the river was still navigable for seagoing ships, but close enough to the interior to control traffic in both directions. Rouen had been a significant city since Roman times. It had walls and churches and a substantial population. It offered Rollo a ready-made centre for his new domain. Rollo established his court at Rouen. He gathered around him the men who had followed him through years of raiding. These warriors became the nucleus of the Norman aristocracy. They received grants of land in exchange for military service. They built castles and manor houses. They married local women and raised families. They put down roots in the soil of Normandy. The distribution of land was a delicate process. Rollo had to reward his loyal followers without completely dispossessing the existing Frankish landholders. He needed the cooperation of the local population to make his rule work. A policy of total confiscation would have created endless resistance. A policy of leaving everything unchanged would have left his warriors without reward. Rollo had to find a balance. The solution seems to have been a mixture of approaches. Some Frankish landholders lost everything. Their estates were given to Norse warriors. Others kept their lands but had to accept Norse overlords. Still others were left largely undisturbed, especially in areas where Rollo's control was less secure. The pattern varied from place to place depending on local circumstances. The legal system in early Normandy was similarly mixed. Norse customs and Frankish law coexisted uneasily. Rollo seems to have allowed different communities to follow their own traditions. Norse settlers lived by Norse law. Frankish peasants lived by Frankish custom. Over time, these different traditions would merge into a distinctive Norman legal system, but that fusion took generations to accomplish. One area where Rollo made his mark was in the administration of justice. According to later Norman tradition, Rollo was a stern but fair judge. He punished criminals harshly, especially thieves. The story was told that Rollo hung his gold bracelet on a tree near Rouen, and it remained untouched for 3 years because everyone knew the penalty for theft. This story is probably legendary, but it reflects a real truth. Rollo worked to establish order in his territory. He made Normandy safe for farmers and merchants. The economy of Normandy began to recover under Rollo's rule. The endless raids had devastated the region. Farms had been abandoned, trade had collapsed, towns had shrunk. Rollo's peace allowed rebuilding to begin. Peasants returned to their fields. Merchants resumed their travels. Craftsmen reopened their workshops. The process was slow, but it was real. Trade was particularly important for Normandy's development. The Seine River connected the region to the interior of France and to the sea. Rouen became a major trading centre, handling goods from across Europe. Norse merchants maintained connections to Scandinavia and the wider Viking world. Frankish merchants brought products from the south. Normandy sat at a crossroads, and it profited from its position. The church gradually recovered its strength in Normandy. Rollo, despite his recent conversion, supported ecclesiastical restoration. He returned properties that had been seized during the raids. He made new grants to support religious communities. He worked with Archbishop Franco of Rouen to rebuild the institutional church. These efforts were partly sincere and partly political. A strong church legitimized Norman rule and provided educated administrators. The restoration of monasteries was particularly significant. Monasteries were not just religious institutions. They were centers of learning and culture. They preserved books and maintained schools. They provided social services, caring for the poor and sick. They managed large estates and contributed to economic development. A region without functioning monasteries was impoverished in many ways. Rollo understood this, even if his understanding was practical rather than spiritual. The monastery of Saint-Ouen in Rouen was among the first to be restored. This ancient foundation had been devastated by Viking raids. Under Rollo's patronage, it began to recover. Monks returned, buildings were repaired, the religious life resumed. Saint-Ouen would become one of the great monasteries of Normandy, a centre of Norman culture and identity. Other monasteries followed. Jumièges, another ancient foundation on the Seine, was gradually rebuilt. New monasteries were established in places that had never had them before. The monastic network that would make Normandy famous for its religious life was beginning to take shape. Rollo deserves credit for starting this process, even if his successors would do more to advance it. The relationship between Rollo and his Frankish overlord remained complicated. In theory, Rollo was a vassal of King Charles the Simple. He owed loyalty and military service. He was supposed to support the king against his enemies. In practice, Rollo acted as an independent ruler. He made his own decisions about war and peace. He conducted his own foreign policy. He treated with other powers as an equal. Charles the Simple was too weak to enforce his theoretical authority. He had many problems besides Normandy. Rival claimants challenged his throne. Powerful nobles defied his commands. The kingdom was fragmenting into semi-independent principalities. Normandy was just one of many territories where royal authority was more nominal than real. Rollo took advantage of this weakness to expand his territory. The original grant of 911 covered only the area around Rouen. By the time of Rollo's death, Norman control had spread considerably. The exact stages of this expansion are unclear, but the general pattern is not. Rollo pushed outward whenever opportunity allowed. He absorbed neighbouring territories through a combination of force and negotiation. The expansion brought new challenges. Each new territory had its own population, its own traditions, its own local powers. Integrating these diverse elements into a coherent duchy was difficult. Rollo had to balance the interests of his original Norse followers against those of newly acquired subjects. He had to extend his administrative systems to cover larger areas. He had to defend longer borders against more numerous enemies. Rollo's success in meeting these challenges established patterns that his successors would follow. He showed that a Viking leader could become a territorial ruler. He demonstrated that Norse and Frankish elements could be combined into something new. He proved that the violent energy of the Vikings could be channeled into state building. These lessons would guide Norman development for generations. The transformation of Normandy was not complete when Rollo died. Much remained to be done. The Norse and Frankish populations had not fully merged. The administrative systems were still primitive. The borders were not yet secure. The church had not fully recovered. But the foundations had been laid. The direction had been set. Normandy was on its way to becoming one of the great powers of medieval Europe. Rollo's personal life during these years of state building is poorly documented. We know he had children who would continue his work. We know he maintained his position as duke until old age. We know he was respected and feared by friends and enemies alike. But the details of his daily life, his personality, his private thoughts, these are lost to us. We see Rollo through the lens of his public achievements, not his private character. The later years of Rollo's rule were probably quieter than his early career. The great raids were over. The major battles had been fought. Now came the slower work of administration and consolidation. This work was less dramatic, but equally important. A duchy is not built in a day. It requires patient effort over many years. Rollo provided that effort, laying the groundwork for everything that would follow. Rollo ruled Normandy for approximately 20 years after the Treaty of 911. During this time, he transformed himself from a Viking warlord into something resembling a medieval prince. The transformation was never complete. Rollo remained a warrior at heart, a man shaped by decades of raiding and fighting. But he adapted to his new circumstances. He learned to govern as well as to conquer. The title that Rollo held is a matter of some confusion. Later sources call him Duke of Normandy, but this title may not have been used during his lifetime. Contemporary documents refer to him as Count, or simply as leader of the Normans. The ducal title probably emerged gradually as Norman power grew. By the time of Rollo's grandson, it was firmly established. But in Rollo's own day, titles mattered less than power. The power that Rollo wielded was personal and military. He ruled because he commanded the loyalty of fighting men. His authority derived from his reputation, his wealth, and his ability to reward followers and punish enemies. This was a very different kind of power from that of later medieval rulers who governed through elaborate bureaucracies and legal systems. Rollo's Normandy was a warrior society organised for war. Yet even a warrior society needs administration. Someone has to collect taxes, someone has to settle disputes, someone has to maintain roads and bridges, someone has to organise the defence of the territory. Rollo had to develop systems for all of these functions. He had to create the rudiments of a state. The administrative system that emerged in early Normandy drew on both Norse and Frankish traditions. From the Norse side came the emphasis on personal loyalty and military organisation. The duke's household was the centre of government. His warriors were his administrators. Commands were given orally and enforced through personal relationships. This was how Viking chieftains had always operated. From the Frankish side came more sophisticated techniques. The Franks had inherited Roman traditions of written administration. They kept records. They issued charters. They used standard formulas for legal documents. Rollo adopted these practices, at least partially. He employed Frankish clerks who knew how to produce official documents. He issued charters granting lands and privileges. He created a paper trail that would help legitimize Norman rule. The church provided essential administrative support. Bishops and abbots were educated men who could read and write. They understood law and finance. They had experience managing large estates. They could serve as advisors, diplomats, and record keepers. Rollo relied on churchmen for many of the skilled tasks that his Norse warriors could not perform. Archbishop Franco of Rouen was particularly important in the early years. He helped Rollo navigate the complexities of Frankish politics. He provided legitimacy for the new regime. He assisted with the practical work of administration. The relationship between duke and archbishop set a pattern that would continue for generations. The Norman dukes would work closely with the church, supporting it generously in exchange for its services. The legal system in Rollo's Normandy was rough but effective. Disputes were settled by the duke or his representatives. Serious crimes were punished harshly. The goal was to maintain order, to make Normandy safe for productive activity. Rollo did not have elaborate courts or trained judges. He had his own judgments and the force to back it up. The famous story of Rollo's justice illustrates his approach. A farmer came to him complaining that his plough had been stolen. Rollo investigated and found the thief. He had the man hanged and returned the plough to its owner. Then he had the farmer hanged as well, for leaving his plough unguarded. The message was clear. Everyone was responsible for maintaining order. Carelessness was as culpable as theft. This story may be legendary, but it captures something real about early Norman justice. It was swift and severe. It did not distinguish carefully between different degrees of guilt. It aimed at deterrence through fear. This approach was effective in establishing order, even if it offended later sensibilities. Normandy under Rollo was a safe place to live and work, at least compared to the chaos that had preceded it. Taxation in early Normandy was probably simple and direct. The Duke took a share of agricultural production. He collected tolls on trade. He demanded military service from his followers. He confiscated the property of those who defied him. There was no elaborate system of assessment and collection. The Duke took what he needed and what he could get. The military organisation of Normandy reflected its Viking origins. The core of the army was the Duke's personal war band, the warriors who lived in his household and followed him everywhere. Around this core were the landholders who owed military service in exchange for their estates. When the Duke called, they came with their own followers and equipment. The Norman military system would eventually become famous for its heavy cavalry. Mounted knights in armour would be the dominant force on medieval battlefields. But this development came later. In Rollo's time, the Normans still fought primarily on foot, in the Viking manner. They used swords and axes and spears. They formed shield walls and charged their enemies. Horses were for transportation, not combat. The transition to cavalry warfare was gradual. The Normans learned from their Frankish neighbours, who had long traditions of mounted combat. They adopted Frankish weapons and tactics. They bred horses suitable for war. By the time of Rollo's grandson, the Norman cavalry was becoming a formidable force. But Rollo himself probably never charged into battle on horseback. Naval power remained important throughout Rollo's reign. The longships that had brought the Vikings to Francia were still useful. They allowed the Normans to project power along the coast and up the rivers. They provided defence against seaborne threats. They maintained connections to Scandinavia and the wider Viking world. Rollo kept his fleet ready, even as he built his land-based power. The population of Normandy during Rollo's reign was mixed. The Norse settlers were a minority, concentrated in certain areas. The bulk of the population was Frankish, descendants of the Gallo-Roman people who had lived there for centuries. There were also other groups, remnants of earlier migrations and settlements. This diverse population had to be welded into a single community. Language was one marker of difference. The Norse settlers spoke Old Norse, a North Germanic language. The Frankish population spoke a Romance language, descended from Latin. These languages were mutually incomprehensible. Communication required interpreters or the slow process of learning each other's tongues. Over time, the Norse language faded in Normandy. The settlers were outnumbered by the native population. They intermarried with Frankish families. Their children grew up bilingual, then monolingual in Romance. By the end of the 10th century, Norse was dying out in Normandy. The Normans spoke French, though, with distinctive vocabulary and accent. This linguistic shift was part of a broader cultural transformation. The Norse settlers gradually adopted Frankish ways. They converted to Christianity, not just formally but in actual belief and practice. They adopted Frankish styles of dress and architecture. They took Frankish names. They married into Frankish families. Within a few generations, the descendants of Vikings had become Frenchmen. Yet the Norman identity remained distinct. The Normans remembered their Viking origins. They cultivated a reputation for martial prowess. They maintained some Norse customs and traditions. They saw themselves as different from other French, tougher and more warlike. This sense of distinctiveness would persist for centuries, long after any real cultural differences had faded. Rollo himself embodied this process of transformation. He had been born a pagan Viking. He died a Christian duke. He had spent his youth raiding and plundering. He spent his old age governing and building. He had been an outsider, an enemy of Frankish civilization. He became an insider, a pillar of the Frankish political order. His life traced the arc that Normandy as a whole would follow. The transformation was not without tensions. Some of Rollo's followers resisted the changes. They preferred the old ways, the freedom of the raiding life, the worship of the old gods. These men were a problem for Rollo. He needed their military strength, but he also needed to maintain his new relationships with the Frankish world. Balancing these competing demands required constant effort. Religion was a particular point of tension. Rollo had accepted baptism as part of the Treaty of 911, but how sincere was his conversion? Later sources suggest that Rollo hedged his bets. According to one story, he made gifts to Christian churches on his deathbed, but he also ordered the sacrifice of prisoners to the Norse gods. He wanted to be covered either way, in case the Christians were wrong about the afterlife. This story may be exaggerated or invented, but it reflects a real truth about the early Norman conversion. It was gradual and incomplete. Many of the first generation of settlers probably maintained some attachment to the old gods. They went through the motions of Christianity without fully embracing it. True conversion came later, with the second and third generations who grew up knowing only the Christian faith. The church worked hard to complete the conversion. Missionaries preached to the Norse settlers. Priests administered the sacraments. Monasteries provided examples of Christian life. Churches were built in every village. The institutional weight of Christianity gradually overwhelmed the remnants of paganism. By the mid-10th century, Normandy was thoroughly Christian. Rollo supported this process, whatever his personal beliefs. He understood that Christianity was essential for integration into the Frankish world. A pagan duchy would always be an outsider, suspect and vulnerable. A Christian duchy could participate fully in Frankish politics and society. The practical benefits of conversion were clear, even if the spiritual benefits were less certain. The physical landscape of Normandy began to change under Rollo's rule. New buildings went up. Churches were constructed or restored. Fortifications were built to defend strategic points. Roads were maintained to facilitate trade and military movement. The scars of the raiding years slowly healed. Rouen itself was transformed. The city had been damaged during the years of conflict. Under Rollo, it was rebuilt and expanded. New walls were constructed to protect the growing population. The cathedral was restored. Markets flourished. Rouen became a proper capital, a centre of power and culture worthy of its new rulers. The countryside also recovered. Farms that had been abandoned were brought back into cultivation. New settlements were established. The population began to grow again after decades of decline. The peace that Rollo imposed allowed ordinary people to get on with their lives, to plant crops and raise families without constant fear of violence. Trade routes reopened. Merchants travelled to and from Normandy with increasing frequency. The Seine became a highway for commerce rather than a pathway for raiders. Goods flowed in both directions, enriching Normandy and connecting it to the broader European economy. The duchy was becoming prosperous as well as powerful. Rollo's relationship with the Frankish king remained complex throughout his reign. In theory, he was a loyal vassal. In practice, he was nearly independent. He paid lip service to royal authority while doing largely as he pleased. The kings were too weak to challenge him, and he was too smart to provoke them unnecessarily. The political situation in the Frankish kingdom was chaotic during Rollo's later years. Charles the Simple, who had granted Rollo his lands, faced constant challenges. In 922, he was overthrown by a coalition of nobles. He spent the rest of his life in captivity, dying in 929. The throne passed to other hands, first to Robert, then to Rudolf of Burgundy. Rollo navigated these changes with skill. He maintained his position regardless of who sat on the Frankish throne. He made deals with whoever held power. He avoided taking sides in Frankish civil wars unless he could benefit directly. His goal was always the same: to protect and expand his own territory. Everything else was secondary. The later years of Rollo's reign were probably his most peaceful. The great struggles were behind him. He had established his duchy and secured his position. Now he could enjoy the fruits of his labours. He was wealthy and powerful, respected by friends and feared by enemies. He had achieved more than most men could dream of. But old age brings its own challenges. Rollo's strength faded as the years passed. He could no longer lead his men in battle. He had to rely on others to enforce his will. The question of succession became pressing. Who would rule Normandy after Rollo was gone? Would his achievements survive him, or would they crumble with his death? Rollo's family life is poorly documented, but we know enough to trace the outlines. He had at least 2 significant relationships and several children. These children would carry on his work, building on the foundations he had laid. The dynasty he founded would rule Normandy for nearly 3 centuries and would eventually conquer England. Rollo's first known partner was a woman named Poppa. She was Frankish, the daughter of a nobleman named Berengar. Some sources say Berengar was the Count of Rennes, though this is uncertain. Poppa was probably captured during one of Rollo's raids and became his concubine. This was a common pattern in Viking society. High-status captives were kept as partners, their noble blood adding prestige to their captors. The relationship between Rollo and Poppa was not a Christian marriage. The church would not have recognized a union between a pagan and a Christian, especially one that began with capture. But it was a real partnership nonetheless. Poppa bore Rollo at least 2 children, a son named William and a daughter named Gerlock. These children would play crucial roles in Norman history. William, later known as William Longsword, was Rollo's heir. He would succeed his father as ruler of Normandy and continue the work of building the duchy. We will discuss his career shortly. Gerlock married William, Count of Poitou, forming an alliance with one of the great noble families of France. Through her, Rollo's blood spread into the aristocracy of southern France. After his baptism in 911, Rollo married Gisela, the woman provided by King Charles the Simple as part of the treaty agreement. As mentioned earlier, the historical existence of Gisela is debated. Some sources describe her as Charles's daughter. Others suggest she may have been a different woman entirely, perhaps a relative of the king rather than his child. The sources are confused and contradictory. What seems clear is that Rollo did take a Christian wife after his baptism. This marriage legitimized his position in the eyes of the church and the Frankish nobility. It connected his family to the Carolingian dynasty, however distantly. It produced no surviving children that we know of, but it served its political purpose. The relationship between Rollo and Poppa apparently continued even after his marriage to Gisela. This was not unusual in medieval aristocratic society. Great lords often maintained multiple partners. The church disapproved, but could not always enforce its rules. Poppa may have remained with Rollo until his death, a partner of decades standing even if not a legal wife. William Longsword was probably born around 900, though the exact date is uncertain. He grew up in his father's household, learning the skills he would need to rule. He learned to fight and to lead men. He learned the complexities of Frankish politics. He learned how to balance the different elements of Norman society. He was being prepared for the responsibility that would eventually fall on his shoulders. The nickname Longsword suggests that William was a formidable warrior. The sword was the weapon of a nobleman, expensive and prestigious. A man known for his sword was a man known for his martial prowess. William would need that prowess. The duchy his father had built was not yet secure. It would require constant defence and careful management. Rollo began to share power with William in his later years. This was a common practice among medieval rulers. An ageing lord would associate his heir with his rule, gradually transferring authority while still alive. This smoothed the transition and reduced the risk of succession disputes. Rollo was wise enough to plan for the future. The transfer of power from Rollo to William probably occurred around 927 or 928. The exact date is uncertain, as are the exact circumstances. Some sources suggest that Rollo formally abdicated, handing over full authority to his son. Others imply a more gradual transition, with Rollo retaining some role until his death. Either way, William was ruling Normandy by the end of the 920s. Rollo lived for several more years after transferring power. He died around 930, though again the exact date is debated. Some sources place his death as early as 927, others as late as 933. He was probably in his 70s or 80s, a remarkable age for a man who had lived such a violent life. He had survived decades of warfare and had died in his bed, surrounded by the wealth and power he had accumulated. The circumstances of Rollo's death are described in a famous and controversial passage by the chronicler Adhemar of Chabannes. According to Adhemar, Rollo made generous gifts to Christian churches in his final days, but he also ordered the beheading of 100 prisoners as a sacrifice to the pagan gods. He wanted to ensure his welcome in the afterlife, whichever religion turned out to be correct. This story has troubled historians. Is it true? Was Rollo really a secret pagan who reverted to the old ways on his deathbed? Or is this a later invention designed to make the early Normans look bad? The truth is impossible to determine. The story may contain a kernel of truth, or it may be pure fabrication. What it certainly reflects is the ambiguity of Rollo's religious position in the minds of later generations. Rollo was buried in Rouen, probably in the cathedral. His tomb became a site of veneration for later Normans, who honoured him as the founder of their duchy. The exact location of his burial has been lost over the centuries. Wars and revolutions have destroyed or damaged many of the medieval monuments of Rouen, but Rollo's memory survived, even when his physical remains did not. William Longsword proved a worthy successor. He ruled Normandy for about 15 years, from around 927 until his assassination in 942. During this time, he consolidated and expanded his father's achievements. He extended Norman territory to include the Bessin and the Cotentin. He strengthened the administrative systems of the duchy. He continued the process of integrating Norse and Frankish elements. William was more thoroughly Frankish than his father had been. He had grown up in Normandy, speaking both Norse and French. He was comfortable with Frankish customs and institutions. He was a sincere Christian, not just a convert of convenience. He represented the second generation of Normans, the generation that bridged the gap between Viking past and French future. William's reign was not without difficulties. He faced rebellion from some of his Norse followers, who resented the increasing Frankishness of the duchy. He had to navigate the treacherous politics of the Frankish kingdom, where different factions competed for power. He dealt with threats from neighbouring lords who envied Norman success. Ruling Normandy required constant vigilance and skill. The assassination of William Longsword in 942 was a severe blow. He was killed by followers of Arnulf, Count of Flanders, during what was supposed to be a peace conference. The murder was an act of treachery that shocked contemporaries. It left Normandy in a vulnerable position, with William's son Richard still a young child. Richard, later known as Richard the Fearless, was only about 10 years old when his father died. The duchy faced a succession crisis. Powerful neighbours saw an opportunity to dismember Norman territory. Internal factions competed for control. For a time it seemed that everything Rollo and William had built might be lost. But Normandy survived. Richard was protected by loyal supporters who maintained his position through the dangerous years of his minority. He grew into a capable ruler who would reign for over 50 years. Under Richard, Normandy reached its full territorial extent and became firmly established as one of the great principalities of France. Richard the Fearless was followed by Richard the Good, who ruled from 996 to 1026. Richard the Good was followed by Richard III, who died after only a year in power, and then by Robert the Magnificent, who ruled until 1035. Robert was the father of William, who would become known as William the Conqueror. The line of succession stretched unbroken from Rollo to the conquest of England. Each generation built on the work of those who came before. The duchy grew stronger and more sophisticated. The administrative systems became more elaborate. The church flourished under Norman patronage. The military power of Normandy became legendary. The Norman knights were among the most feared warriors in Europe. The Norman identity that emerged during these generations was distinctive. The Normans saw themselves as a martial people, heirs to Viking traditions of courage and aggression. They were proud of their origins, even as they became thoroughly French in language and culture. They cultivated a reputation for military excellence that attracted ambitious warriors from across Europe. The Norman expansion was not limited to the duchy itself. Norman adventurers sought their fortunes throughout the medieval world. They went to southern Italy, where they carved out kingdoms and principalities. They went to the Holy Land, where they played leading roles in the Crusades. They went to England, where they would achieve their greatest triumph. Wherever they went, they brought Norman energy and Norman ambition. All of this began with Rollo. He was the founder, the first duke, the man who transformed a band of raiders into a ruling dynasty. Without him, there would have been no Normandy. Without Normandy, there would have been no Norman conquest. The history of England, of France, of Europe itself would have been profoundly different. Rollo's legacy was not just political. He also left a genetic legacy that spread throughout the aristocracy of medieval Europe. His descendants married into royal and noble families across the continent. By the High Middle Ages, virtually every crowned head in Europe could trace ancestry back to the Viking chieftain who had settled on the Seine. The memory of Rollo was preserved and embellished over the centuries. Later Normans told stories about their founder, some true and some invented. They portrayed him as a mighty warrior, a wise ruler, a founder of dynasties. They glossed over the violence and paganism of his early career. They made him a hero suitable for a Christian duchy. The chronicler Dudo of Saint-Quentin, writing around the year 1000, produced the most elaborate account of Rollo's life. Dudo was commissioned by Richard the Fearless to write a history of the Norman dukes. His work is part history, part propaganda, designed to glorify the ruling dynasty. It must be read critically, but it remains our best source for Rollo's career. Later writers built on Dudo's foundation. They added details, some from genuine tradition and some from imagination. The story of Rollo grew with each retelling. By the time of the Norman conquest, he had become a legendary figure, larger than life, the embodiment of Norman virtues. Modern historians have tried to separate fact from legend. They have examined the sources critically, comparing different accounts and looking for contemporary evidence. The picture that emerges is less colourful than the legends, but no less impressive. Rollo was a real man who accomplished remarkable things. He does not need legendary embellishment to be worthy of remembrance. The story of Rollo would be incomplete without considering what his descendants achieved. The duchy he founded became the launching pad for one of the most significant events in English history. The Norman conquest of 1066 reshaped England and changed the course of European civilization. That conquest was the ultimate fruit of the seed Rollo had planted. The connection between Normandy and England developed gradually over the 10th and 11th centuries. The two lands faced each other across the English Channel. Trade and communication flowed between them. The Norman dukes and the English kings were aware of each other, sometimes as rivals and sometimes as allies. The relationship became closer in 1002 when King Ethelred of England married Emma, daughter of Duke Richard the Fearless. This marriage was part of a diplomatic arrangement. Ethelred hoped to prevent the Normans from harbouring his Viking enemies. The Normans gained prestige from the connection to the English crown. Emma would play a significant role in the history of both countries. Emma bore Ethelred 2 sons, Edward and Alfred. When the Danish king Knut conquered England in 1016, Emma and her sons fled to Normandy. They spent years in exile at the Norman court. Edward, the elder son, grew up more Norman than English. He spoke French. He had Norman friends and Norman habits. He was shaped by his years in Normandy. Edward returned to England in 1041 and became king in 1042. He is known to history as Edward the Confessor, a pious king who was later recognised as a saint. Edward's reign was troubled by conflicts with powerful English nobles, particularly the Godwin family. He relied on Norman advisers and favourites, which created resentment among the English. Edward had no children. The question of who would succeed him became increasingly urgent as he aged. Several candidates emerged. Harold Godwinson, the most powerful English noble, had the support of much of the English aristocracy. William, Duke of Normandy, claimed that Edward had promised him the throne. The stage was set for a succession crisis. William was Rollo's great-great-great-grandson. He was born around 1028, the illegitimate son of Duke Robert the Magnificent and a woman named Herleva. Despite his illegitimacy, William inherited the duchy when his father died on pilgrimage in 1035. He spent his youth fighting to maintain his position against rebellious nobles and hostile neighbours. By the 1060s, William had established firm control over Normandy. He had proven himself a capable warrior and a shrewd politician. He had built one of the most effective military machines in Europe. He was ready for a larger stage. The English succession offered an opportunity he could not resist. The exact nature of Edward's promise to William is disputed. Norman sources claim that Edward designated William as his heir and that Harold Godwinson swore an oath to support William's claim. English sources tell a different story. They say that Edward, on his deathbed, designated Harold as his successor. The truth may never be known with certainty. What is certain is that Harold took the English throne when Edward died in January 1066. William immediately began preparing an invasion. He gathered an army from Normandy and beyond. He built a fleet to carry his forces across the Channel. He secured papal blessing for his enterprise, portraying it as a righteous cause. The invasion fleet sailed in late September 1066. William landed at Pevensey on the south coast of England. He built a fortification and waited for Harold to respond. Harold was in the north, having just defeated a Norwegian invasion at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. He marched his army south at remarkable speed to confront the Norman threat. The two armies met at Hastings on October 14th, 1066. The battle lasted most of the day. The English fought on foot, forming a shield wall on a ridge. The Normans attacked with cavalry, infantry, and archers. The fighting was fierce and bloody. For hours neither side could gain a decisive advantage. The turning point came late in the day. The Norman cavalry feigned retreat, drawing some of the English defenders out of their formation. When the English pursued, the Normans turned and cut them down. The English line began to waver. Then Harold was killed, struck in the eye by an arrow according to famous tradition. With their king dead, the English resistance collapsed. The Battle of Hastings was one of the most decisive battles in European history. It gave William control of England. Over the following years he consolidated his conquest, crushing resistance and redistributing land to his Norman followers. England was transformed. Its ruling class was replaced. Its language was changed. Its connection to Scandinavia was severed, replaced by a connection to France. The Norman conquest brought profound changes to England. The Normans introduced new systems of government and law. They built castles across the land, stone fortresses that symbolized their power. They constructed great cathedrals and monasteries in the Romanesque style. They reorganized the English church along Norman lines. The English language itself was transformed. The Norman rulers spoke French. For centuries, French was the language of the court and the aristocracy. English survived among the common people, but it absorbed thousands of French words. The English we speak today is a hybrid language, shaped by the Norman conquest. The Normans also brought a new military culture. The mounted knight became the dominant figure on the battlefield. Castles became the key to controlling territory. The feudal system was elaborated and systematized. England became part of a Norman world that stretched from Scotland to Sicily. William the Conqueror ruled England until his death in 1087. He was succeeded by his sons, first William Rufus and then Henry I. The Norman dynasty continued until 1135, when Henry died without a male heir. The succession dispute that followed eventually brought the Plantagenet dynasty to power, but the Plantagenets were themselves descended from the Normans through the female line. The Norman legacy in England persisted for centuries. The aristocracy remained French-speaking until the 14th century. Norman legal and administrative practices shaped English institutions. Norman architecture defined the English landscape. The Norman conquest was not just a change of rulers. It was a transformation of English civilization. And all of this traced back to Rollo. The Viking raider who settled on the Seine had set in motion a chain of events that would reshape the world. He could not have imagined what his descendants would achieve. He was focused on his own time, his own challenges, his own ambitions. But the consequences of his actions extended far beyond his own life. The connection between Rollo and William the Conqueror was direct and acknowledged. William knew who his ancestor was. He honoured Rollo's memory. He saw himself as continuing a tradition of Norman expansion and conquest. The spirit of the Vikings lived on in the Norman knights who charged at Hastings. Yet William was also profoundly different from Rollo. He was a Christian prince, not a pagan raider. He was French in language and culture, not Norse. He ruled through elaborate institutions, not personal charisma alone. The transformation that Rollo had begun was complete in William. The Viking had become a medieval king. The Norman impact extended beyond England. Norman adventurers had been active in southern Italy since the early 11th century. They carved out territories for themselves, fighting against Byzantines and Muslims and local Italian powers. By the time of the conquest of England, there was already a Norman kingdom in Sicily and southern Italy. Robert Guiscard and his brothers were the leaders of the Italian Normans. They were not directly related to the Dukes of Normandy, but they came from the same stock. They shared the same heritage of Viking energy, channeled into medieval state building. They created a kingdom that would last for centuries, a blend of Norman, Italian, Greek, and Arab elements. The Normans also played a major role in the Crusades. When Pope Urban II called for a holy war to recapture Jerusalem in 1095, Normans were among the first to respond. Bohemond of Taranto, a son of Robert Guiscard, became one of the leaders of the First Crusade. He founded the Principality of Antioch, ruling a Crusader state in the heart of the Middle East. The Norman contribution to the Crusades was substantial. Norman knights fought in every major campaign. Norman rulers governed Crusader states. Norman military techniques shaped Crusader warfare. The reputation for martial prowess that the Normans had cultivated served them well in the Holy Wars. The Norman expansion was one of the remarkable phenomena of the medieval period. A relatively small group of people, descended from Viking settlers in northern France, spread their influence across Europe and beyond. They conquered England. They ruled Sicily. They fought in the Crusades. They left their mark wherever they went. What explains this Norman dynamism? Historians have offered various theories. Some point to the martial culture that the Normans cultivated, their emphasis on warfare and conquest. Others highlight the surplus of younger sons in Norman noble families, men who had to seek their fortunes elsewhere because they would not inherit at home. Still others emphasize Norman adaptability, their ability to absorb new ideas and techniques from the peoples they encountered. All of these factors probably played a role. The Norman phenomenon was complex, the product of many causes, but at its root was the tradition established by Rollo. He had shown that a bold man with a strong arm could carve out a place for himself. He had demonstrated that outsiders could become insiders, that raiders could become rulers. His example inspired generations of Norman adventurers. The story of Rollo is thus not just the story of one man. It is the story of a transformation that reshaped medieval Europe. The Vikings who terrorized Christendom became the Normans who conquered and built. The pagans who burned churches became the Christians who constructed cathedrals. The outsiders who raided became the insiders who ruled. This transformation was not inevitable. It required particular circumstances and particular individuals. It required the weakness of the Frankish kingdom and the strength of Viking arms. It required leaders like Rollo who could see beyond immediate plunder to long-term settlement. It required the willingness of both sides to make deals and keep them. Many things had to come together for Normandy to emerge, but emerge it did. And once it existed, Normandy became a force that shaped history. The duchy that Rollo founded was the seed from which great events grew. The Norman conquest of England, the Norman kingdom of Sicily, the Norman role in the Crusades, all of these trace back to the settlement on the Seine. Rollo's decision to accept baptism and become a Frankish vassal had consequences he could never have imagined. The memory of Rollo has been preserved and transformed over the centuries. Each generation has seen him differently, emphasizing different aspects of his story. The historical Rollo, the legendary Rollo, and the popular Rollo are not quite the same figure. Understanding how his image has evolved helps us appreciate both the man himself and the cultures that remembered him. The earliest accounts of Rollo come from chronicles written within a century or two of his death. These sources are valuable, but problematic. They were written by churchmen who had their own agendas. They were often hostile to the Vikings, viewing them as enemies of God and civilization. They had limited information and filled gaps with speculation or invention. Dudo of Saint-Quentin, writing around the year 1000, produced the most detailed early account of Rollo. Dudo was commissioned by the Norman dukes to write a history of their dynasty. His work, the Historia Normanorum, is part history and part propaganda. He wanted to glorify his patrons, to present the Norman dukes as legitimate and noble rulers. Dudo's Rollo is a heroic figure, brave and wise and destined for greatness. Dudo traces Rollo's ancestry back to legendary Scandinavian kings. He describes Rollo's exile from Norway and his adventures before reaching Francia. He portrays the settlement of Normandy as a divinely ordained event, part of God's plan for the world. Modern historians treat Dudo's account with caution. Much of what he wrote cannot be verified from other sources. Some of his claims are clearly exaggerated or invented. But Dudo remains essential because he preserves traditions that would otherwise be lost. He gives us a window into how the Normans of the year 1000 understood their own origins. Later medieval writers built on Dudo's foundation. They added details and elaborated stories. The legend of Rollo grew with each retelling. By the High Middle Ages, he had become a figure of romance, a mighty warrior whose deeds were celebrated in song and story. The Icelandic sagas offer a different perspective on Rollo. These Norse sources call him Gongu Hrolf, walking Hrolf, because he was too large to ride a horse. The sagas place his origins in Norway and connect him to other legendary figures. They preserve traditions that differ from the Norman accounts, reminding us that Rollo was remembered in Scandinavia as well as in France. The saga traditions are also problematic as historical sources. They were written down centuries after the events they describe. They mix history with legend freely. They reflect the concerns of later Icelandic society as much as the realities of the Viking age. But they add another dimension to our understanding of Rollo, showing how he was remembered in his ancestral homeland. The Renaissance and early modern periods saw renewed interest in Rollo as a founder figure. Norman and French historians studied the origins of their region. They debated Rollo's ancestry and the circumstances of his settlement. They tried to reconcile different sources and construct coherent narratives. The scholarly study of Rollo had begun. The 19th century brought new approaches to the study of the past. Professional historians applied critical methods to medieval sources. They questioned traditional narratives and demanded evidence. The legendary Rollo was stripped away, revealing a more modest but more credible historical figure beneath. 19th century nationalism also shaped the interpretation of Rollo. French historians saw him as a founder of French regional identity. Scandinavian historians claimed him as a representative of Norse expansion. English historians emphasized the connection to the Norman conquest. Each national tradition found something different in Rollo's story. The 20th century brought further refinements. Archaeological evidence supplemented written sources. Comparative studies illuminated Viking society and culture. Interdisciplinary approaches combined history with anthropology, linguistics, and other fields. Our understanding of Rollo's world became richer and more nuanced. Today, Rollo remains a figure of scholarly interest and popular fascination. Academic historians continue to debate the details of his career. Was he Norwegian or Danish? What were the exact terms of the Treaty of 911? How sincere was his conversion to Christianity? These questions may never be answered definitively, but the debate itself keeps Rollo's memory alive. Popular culture has discovered Rollo in recent years. Television series like Vikings have introduced him to millions of viewers who might never have encountered him otherwise. These portrayals are not historically accurate in every detail. They take dramatic liberties and compress timelines. But they capture something essential about Rollo's story: the transformation from raider to ruler, from outsider to insider. The appeal of Rollo's story is timeless. It speaks to universal themes of ambition and adaptation. Here was a man who lost everything and rebuilt from nothing. Here was a man who crossed cultural boundaries and reinvented himself. Here was a man who founded a dynasty that changed history. These are themes that resonate across centuries and cultures. Rollo's story also speaks to questions of identity that remain relevant today. What does it mean to belong to a culture? Can outsiders become insiders? How do immigrant communities integrate while maintaining their distinctiveness? The Normans faced these questions 1,000 years ago. We face versions of them still. The physical legacy of Rollo has largely disappeared. No buildings from his time survive in Normandy. His tomb has been lost. The landscape he knew has been transformed by centuries of change. Yet his legacy persists in other ways. The boundaries of Normandy that he established still exist as administrative divisions. The city of Rouen that he made his capital remains a major centre. The Norman identity that he helped create still resonates. In Rouen, a statue of Rollo stands as a reminder of the city's founder. The statue depicts a mighty warrior, sword in hand, gazing out over the land he claimed. It is a romanticised image, reflecting 19th century ideas about Vikings more than historical reality. But it serves its purpose. It reminds the people of Rouen where they came from. The Norman heritage is celebrated in modern Normandy. Museums tell the story of the Viking settlement and its consequences. Historical sites are preserved and interpreted. The connection to the Viking past is a source of regional pride. Normandy remembers its founder, even if the memory is selective and idealized. The genetic legacy of Rollo is impossible to trace with certainty, but it is probably vast. His descendants married into noble families across Europe. Their descendants married into other families. After 1,000 years of intermarriage, millions of people probably carry some portion of Rollo's DNA. The Viking raider has become an ancestor of countless modern Europeans. Recent advances in genetic testing have allowed some people to explore their Norman ancestry. DNA analysis can reveal Scandinavian heritage that might trace back to the Viking settlers of Normandy. These tests cannot prove descent from Rollo specifically, but they can suggest connections to the population he led. The past reaches into the present through our very genes. The scholarly study of Rollo continues to evolve. New methodologies offer fresh perspectives. Environmental history examines the landscape of early Normandy. Economic history traces patterns of trade and production. Gender history asks about the women in Rollo's life and the roles they played. Each approach reveals aspects of the past that earlier scholars overlooked. The sources for Rollo's life are limited, but scholars continue to squeeze new insights from them. Close reading of familiar texts can reveal previously unnoticed details. Comparison with sources from other regions can illuminate Norman practices. Interdisciplinary approaches can connect textual evidence with material remains. The study of Rollo is not finished. The interpretation of Rollo has also evolved over time. Earlier generations saw him primarily as a conqueror, a warrior who imposed his will through force. More recent scholarship has emphasized his role as a negotiator and state builder. The Treaty of 911 was not just a surrender to Viking pressure. It was a carefully crafted agreement that served the interests of both parties. Rollo was a diplomat as well as a warrior. The religious dimension of Rollo's story has also been re-examined. Earlier accounts often dismissed his conversion as purely cynical, a political maneuver with no spiritual content. More recent scholars have been more cautious. We cannot know what Rollo believed in his heart. His public actions supported Christianity, whatever his private thoughts. The question of sincerity may be unanswerable, and perhaps not the most important question to ask. The Norman settlement of Francia has been placed in broader comparative context. Rollo was not the only Viking leader to accept land in exchange for peace. Similar arrangements were made in England, in Ireland, and elsewhere. Comparing these different settlements helps us understand what was distinctive about Normandy and what was typical of Viking integration more generally. The long-term consequences of Rollo's settlement have also received attention. How did the Norman duchy develop over time? How did it compare to other French principalities? What made the Normans so successful as conquerors and state builders? These questions lead scholars beyond Rollo himself to the broader history of the dynasty and region he founded. The study of Rollo is ultimately the study of transformation. A pagan became a Christian. A raider became a ruler. A band of warriors became a settled aristocracy. A foreign language gave way to French. Norse customs blended with Frankish traditions. Everything changed, yet something persisted. The Norman identity that emerged was new, but it carried traces of its Viking origins. This transformation was not unique to Normandy. Similar processes occurred wherever Vikings settled. In England, in Ireland, in Russia, in Iceland, the Norse newcomers eventually merged with local populations. They adopted local languages and religions. They became part of the societies they had once attacked. The Viking Age ended not with a bang, but with a gradual assimilation. Yet Normandy was distinctive in the completeness and speed of its transformation. Within a few generations, the Normans had become thoroughly French. They had forgotten their Norse language. They had embraced Christianity wholeheartedly. They had adopted Frankish political and military practices. The transformation that took centuries elsewhere happened in decades in Normandy. Why was the Norman transformation so rapid? Several factors probably contributed. The Norse settlers were a minority in a region with a large Frankish population. They were surrounded by Frankish culture on all sides. Their leaders, starting with Rollo, actively promoted integration. The church worked systematically to convert and assimilate the newcomers. All of these forces pushed in the same direction. The result was a hybrid culture that combined the best of both traditions. The Normans retained the Viking energy and martial spirit while adopting Frankish sophistication and organisation. They were warriors who could also build states. They were conquerors who could also govern. This combination made them formidable. Rollo set the pattern that his successors followed. He showed that it was possible to be both Viking and Frankish, both warrior and ruler. He demonstrated that adaptation did not mean weakness. He proved that a man could change without losing himself. His example guided the Norman transformation. The memory of Rollo thus serves multiple purposes. For historians, he is a subject of scholarly inquiry, a figure whose life illuminates broader processes of cultural change. For the people of Normandy, he is a founder figure, a symbol of regional identity. For popular audiences, he is a dramatic character, a Viking hero whose story makes compelling entertainment. Each of these Rollos is valid in its own way. The historical Rollo was a man of his time, shaped by circumstances we can only partially reconstruct. He made decisions based on information and pressures we cannot fully know. He had thoughts and feelings that left no trace in the historical record. The real Rollo is lost to us, hidden behind the sources that claim to describe him. The legendary Rollo is a creation of later generations, embellished and idealized to serve various purposes. He is larger than life, a hero whose deeds grow with each retelling. This Rollo tells us more about the people who created him than about the historical figure himself, but he is not without value. Legends preserve truths that mere facts cannot capture. The popular Rollo of television and film is a modern creation, designed for contemporary audiences. He speaks to modern concerns and embodies modern values. He is recognizable as a hero even to viewers who know nothing about the Viking Age. This Rollo is the most accessible, but also the most distant from historical reality. All three Rollos coexist in our culture. They serve different needs and reach different audiences. The scholarly Rollo satisfies our desire for truth. The legendary Rollo satisfies our desire for meaning. The popular Rollo satisfies our desire for entertainment. Together, they keep the memory of Rollo alive. The story of Rollo will continue to be told as long as people are interested in the past. New generations will discover him and interpret him in their own ways. New evidence may emerge to change our understanding. New questions will be asked that previous generations never thought to pose. The study of history is never finished. What remains constant is the remarkable nature of Rollo's achievement. A man born in Scandinavia, raised as a pagan warrior, driven into exile by political enemies, became the founder of one of the most important dynasties in European history. His descendants conquered England and Sicily. They fought in the Crusades. They shaped the medieval world. All of this began with one man's decision to settle rather than raid, to build rather than destroy.